So you say I would have to catch you having sex with a 13-year-old girl before you could get in trouble?
Before you can put me against the law. Yeah.
So you're a lawyer?
I'm not a lawyer.
Oh.
Put your water down. Keep coming to the street. Go ahead and turn around for me. Hands behind your back.
Ever wonder how the guys caught on TCAP argued their cases in court? We've seen them arrested, tased, and tackled on TV, but access into the subsequent legal proceedings often remains elusive, except for the optimistic predators who tried fighting their cases from prison. In a departure from my previous uploads, this video will focus entirely on the absurdly frivolous criminal appeal of a Mr. Inderjeet Singh. One of the men ensnared in the infamous Riverside investigation, Singh used the screen name Guy from Mars 83 to solicit an online decoy who claimed to be 12. According to Perverted Justice, Inderjeet Singh was arrested in January of 2006. A jury found him guilty of an attempted lewd act with a child under 14 years of age, and he was sentenced to 180 days in jail, 36 months probation, significant fines, registration as a sex offender treatment, and a very long list of restrictions, including submitting a DNA sample, submitting to random searches, and not associating with minors or visiting areas where minors congregate. Singh would later argue that these punishments did not fit his crime. But before we get into the specifics of his appeal, it might be helpful to provide a bit of background information on how criminal trials and appeals often unfold here in the US of A. If you're unfamiliar with this process, consider yourself lucky. After a person is arrested and sentenced, they are often legally entitled to appeal their punishment. An appeal is simply an inmate's way of fighting their cases after a verdict and sentence has already been given. Judicial bodies known as appellate courts exclusively hear the appeals of those who have already been convicted. These judges review countless cases where a defendant alleges that some factual or procedural aspect of their case was overlooked in their original criminal trial. If the appeals court agrees with the defendant, their conviction may be overturned and they may even be freed from imprisonment. But if the appeals court agrees with the original trial court ruling, the defendant remains in prison and the original sentence is upheld. It's best to think of an appeal as a kind of Hail Mary legal tactic that is almost always worth a shot, although that might not be true for the subject of this video. Singh's appeal consisted of two major arguments. One was that there is insufficient evidence provided by the prosecution to convict him. The other was that the trial court requiring him to register as a sex offender violated his constitutional rights. Let's examine the first argument made by Mr. Academic and see how his arcane expertise was not transferable to the law. Insufficient evidence. As astounding as it is, Singh contends that the jury was wrong in assuming he was going to have sex with the decoy he attempted to meet, but similar to the harebrained legal analysis Singh tried to relay to Chris, the appellate court found that his protest was without merit. Singh admitted that it was reasonable to assume that he intended on having sex with the decoy, but he also contended that it was reasonable to assume that he didn't know what he was going to do when he actually met the decoy. But for some bizarre reason, Singh argues that if there are multiple assumptions that could have been made about his intent, that the jury should accept the one most favorable to him. But that isn't how the law works. In order for a person to be found guilty of attempting a lewd or lascivious act with a minor under 14 years of age, as Singh was, two things must be established by the court. One, the defendant intended to commit a lewd and lascivious act with a child under 14 years of age, and two, the defendant took a direct but ineffectual step toward committing a lewd and lascivious act with a child under 14 years of age. The jury looked at the sexual solicitations within the chat log and made the logical inference that his showing up to the house was him trying to complete the crimes he was chatting with the decoy about. His guilty verdict was therefore justified by the evidence presented and therefore valid under the law. But this wasn't Singh's only argument. Equal protection. Using his brilliant academic mind, Singh thought it would be strategic to argue that he was being denied the equal protection that all US citizens are entitled to under the 14th Amendment. This amendment requires that similarly situated people must be treated alike. Singh compared his punishment to the punishments of other sex offenders in a futile attempt to show that he was being treated worse than his fellow sex offenders were, thus violating the Equal Protection Clause. He did this by specifically evaluating a recent California Supreme Court decision. In People v. Hofshire, the defendant appealed his conviction on the grounds that his crimes required that he register as a sex offender for life. Hofshire, a 22-year-old man, met a 16-year-old girl online with whom he would later engage in oral sex. But the issue in Hofshire were not the facts, but the law. The law at that time required that any person convicted of oral copulation with a minor register as a sex offender for life. But at the same time, the law did not automatically require that those guilty of sexual intercourse with a minor do the same, and allowed the court to use its discretion in handing out RSO requirements for those offenses. Hofshire's appeal was basically that defendants who engage in oral sex with minors were treated more harshly than defendants who engage in sexual intercourse with minors due to the lifetime RSO requirement that was accompanied by the former crime. And as shocking as this may sound, this constitutionally based appeal was accepted by the state Supreme Court, who ruled that equal protection under the law meant guilty people of similar crimes face similar punishments. Like Hofshire, Singh compares the punishment of his crime to the punishments of crimes he believes are similar. He points out that those guilty of such crimes as unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, oral copulation with a minor, and sexual penetration with a minor are not automatically required to register as a sex offender, while those guilty of lewd or lascivious conduct with a minor under the age of 14 are. But unlike Hofshire, Singh's appeal was rejected. The court noted that the distinction between these crimes and their requisite punishments is the particularly young age of the victims. The court allows discretion for cases regarding a 17-year-old having sex with a person who just turned 18 on that day, but no such discretion is granted for an adult who attempts to have sex with a child under 14. Those people go directly to jail, they do not pass go, they do not collect $200, and if those people were on TCAP, their crimes remain public record, and people like me troll the fuck out of them for years to come on YouTube. And that pretty much wraps up this video. I felt like it was fitting to make my first legal analysis on this guy, given that he actually tried to convince Chris that his actions were acceptable under California law. I've mentioned this a few times on this channel, but I want to become a lawyer, and I consider researching these cases to be preparation for what I'll be spending a huge amount of time and resources to become. I'm currently in the process of applying to law schools and should start hearing back from them sometime this winter. I'll keep you all posted. Thank you to everyone who stuck around for this whole thing, and let me know in the comments what you thought and what you're hoping to see next. Until next time, guys.